For those of you listening to today's podcast who are interested in cybersecurity issues in the region, check out MEI's new book, Cyber War and Cyber Peace in the Middle East: Digital Conflict in the Cradle of Civilization. It's the first anthology of its kind, collecting essays covering the history and state of Middle East cyber conflict, and it features a foreword by today's guest on the show, Richard Clarke. Cyber War and Cyber Peace in the Middle East is available for purchase in paperback or for Kindle e-readers. Find it on Amazon or at mei.edu/cyber.
From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. My name is Patrick Howell O'Neill. I'm the cybersecurity senior editor for MIT Technology Review. I'm pleased to be stepping in as host this week as we welcome a very special guest. He'll, of course, be familiar to all of the program's listeners, I assume, but it's actually his first time in the show. Richard A. Clarke is a top national and cybersecurity expert with 30 years of policy experience serving in the Pentagon, State Department, and for 3 presidents. He served as special advisor for cyberspace, also known as the Cyber Czar, in the White House National Security Council, and he's chaired and served on numerous cybersecurity advisory boards. His most recent book, The Fifth Domain: Defending Our Country, Our Corporations, and Ourselves in the Age of Cyber Threats, was co-written with Rob Konecki, was published in 2019, and he's also the chairman of the Middle East Institute's Board of Governors. Dick, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Patrick. It's an exciting book. Glad to talk about it. I think cyber war and the Middle East together offer some very unique challenges.
Absolutely. Kind of an endless well of discussion topics. And where I want to start with actually is the timeliness of it. What makes this an important moment to publish this wide-reaching anthology about cyber conflict in the Middle East?
Well, I think there are 2 things going on. One is going on in the region, and one is going on in Washington. In the region, we have had, for the first time, a real breakthrough in Arab-Israeli relations. The so-called Abraham Accords, bringing together Bahrain, Sudan, and most importantly, the UAE with Israel. I don't think we can say enough about how important that is. And putting together Israel, the real cyber powerhouse in the region, with the UAE in this sort of informal alliance, changes the cyber dynamic a lot in the region, and we'll get into that. The other thing that's going on right now, of course, is that there's a new administration in Washington. And as the Biden administration comes in, the Congress is passing the National Defense Authorization Act, the so-called NDAA, which is just filled with new cyber provisions coming out of the Cyber Solarium Commission. Most importantly, a provision that creates by law a new cyber czar in the White House, but confirmed by the Senate and having statutory authority for the first time. So there's an opportunity for the U.S. government to reinvigorate its cyber programs, including its international cyber programs. And if you put these 2 together, the Abraham Accords and the new Biden administration and their new cyber team, which will be announced in the next several weeks, there's a possibility of addressing some of the fundamental concerns that we talk about in the book.
Let's start in DC, and we'll make our way over to the Middle East shortly. So you brought up the NDAA. I think that that's what's on everyone's mind as we transition to a new Biden administration. Let's talk about the National Cyber Director. How does that change the equation for the White House and for Americans in cyberspace?
Well, it gives an all-of-government approach, and it places responsibility in the White House. Now, when I was cyber director in the White House, that was created by executive order. And when I left the job, they closed the office. There have been various senior people in the NSC and whatnot, but there's never really been, since 2004, there's never really been a national cyber czar with legal authority over the government in the White House. This new cyber czar will have statutory authority. And I can't stress enough the importance of having a cyber czar that's confirmed by the Senate. That means the individual in that position, he or she can go to testify before committees, can argue for budgets before congressional appropriations committees, and really be the leader of the orchestra. There are parts of the government in many departments playing important roles in cybersecurity. Some at the Homeland Security Department in CISA, some in DoD, including at the Cyber Command. And there's a small office in the State Department that worries about international affairs. But there's scattered functions throughout the government. And having a person with presidential clout, with the imprimatur of the president, being the conductor of the orchestra, being the leader, the coordinator, bringing a whole of government approach is absolutely necessary, and that's what's been missing.
It's interesting because I think that this is a timely conversation in the sense that we're just about a month past election day, although the election itself felt like it went on for a lot longer than that. But I think that that was a scenario in which the lack of that either national cyber director or just White House function in general was felt pretty sharply, right? I've heard it said that the election security effort, cyber and more broadly, happened in spite of the White House, not because of the White House, specifically because there lacked this office that would do the coordinating so that Cybercom, NSA, CISA, FBI had to work together, but not through the White House. So, do you think that that would be one of the functions of a cyber czar, being able to help in, major national security efforts, for instance, future elections?
Oh, absolutely. And you're absolutely right about what happened. Good people, Chris Krebs over at Homeland in CISA, General Nakasone at Cyber Command, some folks in the FBI, they worked together to coordinate an approach to defend the election and to deflect Russian disinformation efforts and subversion efforts. But they kind of had to hide what they were doing from the White House and keep a low profile. And once they did have a high profile, once Chris Krebs had a high profile after the election and said that was a safe election, he got fired for it. So you can understand the White House, the president fired him. You can understand why they kept their heads down during the campaign. But I think we owe them all a great debt of gratitude for doing the right thing in a bipartisan way. This wasn't about Republican or Democrat. This was about the United States versus Russia. And they did a great job, a story yet untold in detail. They did a great job in defending the country against Russian efforts to affect the election. But they had to do it somewhat secretly because of the White House.
Let's move to a related topic, but stay in Washington, D.C., although I imagine capitals all over the world are thinking about this. So, moving to a new administration, a great opportunity to reapproach big strategic questions, for instance, deterrence. I've actually had a couple of conversations with folks coming out of Western governments recently. And an idea I've heard repeated again and again is that there's nothing to suggest on the subject of deterrence that the existence and willingness to use Western cyber capabilities actually deters attackers, which, on one hand can feel a little bit counterintuitive. On the other hand, looking at, how the last 10 years has gone, starts to add up. I wonder if that sounds right to you, what the impact is of Western cyber capabilities on deterrence.
Well, I had this debate with Senator King, Angus King, who was the co-chair of the Solarium Commission, when he asked me to testify before the commission. And we debated. He's a big deterrence advocate. And I said, I'm sorry, I think the evidence is that deterrence doesn't work. We have offensive capability that should deter people, but they're not deterred. Cyber criminals are certainly not deterred. And the Russians haven't been deterred, nor, frankly, have the Chinese. Chinese, we had an agreement in the Obama administration with the Chinese, late in the Obama administration, for the Chinese and the Americans mutually to stop stealing each other's industrial secrets and intellectual property. And that lasted a little while. And then when Trump came in, it stopped altogether. The Chinese stopped altogether, living up to the agreement. But they're not deterred. So why do we think deterrence is going to work? Now, one argument is we haven't demonstrated our capability enough. We haven't really hurt anybody with a cyber attack in response. And so people think we won't do it. There's some truth to that. But I think cyber criminals in particular can't be deterred. They're trying to make money. And the only thing that will stop them is if they get arrested. Cyber nation states, on the other hand, I think you could deter. through a variety of means. You'd have to demonstrate your willingness to use your cyber weapons, but you'd also have to organize multilateral sanctions, not just U.S. sanctions, but have a group of like minded countries go to China, not just the United States, and say, here are the rules. And if you don't live up to these rules, if you continue to steal our intellectual property and do industrial espionage, you will pay with trade sanctions, not just cyber activity.
Yeah, I think the pithy way that I heard that put recently was there's no need to fight cyber with cyber, which is to say, this is a problem that necessarily connects far beyond one nation's cyber capabilities and into other buckets, whether it's sanctions or other political approaches. And I guess the natural next question is, do you see those other capabilities? Do you see that as realistic in the short term? Is there anything in the new administration that you see suggests that kind of approach that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think everybody involved so far, the Secretary of State nominee, Anthony Blinken, and others, Jake Sullivan over at the White House, National Security Advisor, they've all talked not about cyber, but they've all talked about in every issue having multilateral approaches. We're going to go from an America only administration back to an America leading administration, leading a coalition of like minded nations. And I'm sure that will be applied to cyber.
Let me ask you one more question, DC focused, and then we're going to move to the Middle East. You mentioned earlier Biden's cyber team and what that would mean. What do you want to see out of the people and ideas that he brings in on this issue?
Well, I want to see a coordinated appointment of the team. And that's what I've been urging. They brought out all the financial people together across various departments and announced them together. They brought out all the health people together across all the departments and announced them. I'd like them to see cyber as the same sort of interagency issue, where you need to appoint the head of CISA at Homeland in coordination with the new cyber director at the White House, in coordination with the assistant secretary in the Pentagon who worries about these things, and take it on as a whole of government approach. Don't just say, all right, commerce, you appoint who you want, state, you appoint who you want, but put together a team at the beginning and tell them they're a team and they have to work together and they have to get over their petty interagency turf fights and come up with a strategy where they all know what their swim lane is and they're all going after the same policy.
Let's use the conversation we were just having to move to the Middle East. So we're talking about cyber capabilities, and I want to pivot slightly to the issue of proliferation, which of course is a global issue, but very much includes the Middle East specifically. Certainly, every government in the region is investing in capabilities. Without getting too much into semantics, is it fair to call it an arms race, or how would you characterize the landscape in terms of cyber in the Middle East right now?
Well, I think there is an arms race, and just as countries in the Middle East for years have been engaged in an arms race by buying the most advanced fighter planes, the UAE just bought the F-35. At the same time, it's a lot less obvious, but they're all buying cyber capabilities, somewhat from the United States, although the United States regulates exports and is being a bit more careful about what it exports in the way of cyber capability. But European companies have been selling hacking tools to Middle Eastern countries. And I suspect Israeli companies have been under various guises. Israeli companies are the leading exporter, the leading seller of hacking tools. And I'm sure that if we lifted up the cover in a few Middle Eastern countries, we'd find Israeli tools.
Right. And, I think there's a lot that we don't know about this private industry, but there's a fair bit we do know, that it's a multi-billion dollar industry. It has global business, and plenty of which is in and around the Middle East. And it seems to be a lot of money and power without a lot of transparency or accountability. At least that's the public perception. Would you say that that public perception is accurate? And is there a way to build that accountability and transparency if that's the goal for these kind of private companies?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. It's really hard, and I've tried personally to find who's selling to whom. A lot of it is Israeli. A lot of it is Indian. Some of it is European. But they are selling not only tools, but they're also selling hacking as a service.
Mm.
So they don't just provide the Middle Eastern country with the tools so that their own people can do it. Sometimes they actually do the hack for the Middle Eastern country. There are no real good standards about what can be exported. Many, many years ago, I helped create something called the Missile Control Regime, Missile Technology Control Regime. It was MTCR. And what we did was we listed technologies, subcomponents that were regulated. And we all agreed as a coalition of about 30 nations what parts could be regulated, what parts could be exported, what parts could be exported to what countries. I think we need that in cyberspace. We need a cyber technology control regime where nations that have this sort of capability in the private sector as well as in the government agree on who can and cannot get these tools and agree on some sort of oversight to monitor how they're used. What's the end use control? We don't have the standards, we don't have the international agreement. There's a lot of room for the State Department to take the lead here with a coalition. Israel says it has export controls, but when we look at what's actually going on, it doesn't look that way.
So there's two questions here, and they're again DC and Middle East split. And I'll start with the DC angle, which you just touched on there briefly. What can a new administration do to change the status quo here?
Well, I think they need a diplomatic strategy for cybersecurity. And one component of that, not the only component, but one component would be to make a proposal on cyber export technology, a control regime, and see how many like minded nations they can get to agree to it.
And the other dimension to this is Middle East specific. So when we talk about the countries in the Middle East, fair to say the expectations for what happens out of Iran or the UAE is significantly different than what happens out of Israel, the region's democracy. And yet, as you point out, the level of transparency and accountability on exports, on cyber exports, is virtually nil in Israel. There's no real visibility of what actually is happening there, how it works. Will this require fixing this? Is this going to require international pressure? So, as you said, a strategy from DC, maybe a strategy from Europe in order to exert change on Israel, which, as you said, is an enormous exporter of these kinds of tools and services?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If I go back to my analogy of the missile technology control regime, I had to go to Israel as the American Assistant Secretary of State on behalf of the multinational control regime and say, here are the standards for export of missile technology, and you're violating them, and you have to stop. And from their perspective, this was a matter of making money, and they don't have that much they can export. We persuaded them. The United States had influence back then on Israel. We persuaded them, and some of the Europeans and the Australians joined in on that. I think you'd have to do something like that again to say to Israel, you say you're controlling these exports, but the evidence is otherwise. And you'd also have to go to just beyond the region covered in the book and just beyond the region that the Middle East Institute focuses on. And you have to go to India and say, you have a lot of private sector companies here, whether you know it or not, who are exporting cyber hacking tools and cyber hacking as a service. And you really need to get control of them.
It seems that the EU also, as you mentioned earlier, also has a role here as an exporter, but also a very vocal critic of the industry. And so that's a region that I'm especially interested in seeing how it turns out, because obviously the export regulation in the EU is very different than it is in the US, much more decentralized, much more power within the member states to push back or not really not really pay attention to what the rules are whatsoever. So that's going to be a especially tricky for them to fully solve.
Yeah, I wouldn't go to the EU qua EU. I'd go to the individual states and try to create the coalition of the like-minded nations. I think you want to go after Italy and Germany and France and the United Kingdom, and if you can get them on board, the others will follow.
Fair enough. Let's stick to the topic of Israel for a moment. So the Abraham Accords were now a few months out from that, and that's increased cooperation drastically between the UAE and Israel, two of the heavyweight cyber powers in the region. What does that mean for cyber in the region overall?
Well, you're absolutely right to say that the Abraham Accords have meant a impressive and rapid change in cooperation between Abu Dhabi and Tel Aviv across the board in environment, in education, in healthcare, but also in cyber. Now, we don't know all the details of what their cyber cooperation is, but we know that they share an enemy in Iran. So I think what you might see is a coordinated, and I don't know this, I'm just speculating. You might see a coordinated program of UAE and Israeli cyber attacks on the Revolutionary Guards in Iran, on some of the other Iranian proxies that the Iranians use for terrorism and subversion in other countries in the region.
So, speaking of the UAE, about a decade and a half ago, about 12 years ago, you were working as a consultant with the UAE in terms of their cyber capabilities. And so you have unique first person knowledge there in terms of where a country, I don't know if start is the right term, because saying they started at zero might be wrong, but they've certainly built out their capabilities. Can you give us an overview of that time? What was the UAE trying to build, and how have they gotten to a point now where they are a veritable heavyweight in terms of cyber in the region?
Well, the UAE in the early 2000s realized that they had been spending their money on defense in a traditional way, buying F-16s and tanks and that sort of thing. But the more likely threat to them was from terrorism and was a homeland security threat. And so they did an across the board review of their homeland security requirements, and I was part of that. And I pointed out that we had just done the same thing in the US. And as part of that in the US, we had said there's going to be a new risk of terrorism that involves cyber tools. And you've got all this infrastructure, desalinization plants, huge petrochemical operations that depend on the internet and depend on IT. Although none of your enemies in the region yet have offensive capabilities, they will shortly. And so you need to build out an indigenous capability to defend yourself in this space. And they agreed, and they created the cyber agency, and they began training Emiratis to understand offensive and defensive cyber operations. About the same time, Qatar brought in American consultants, not me, but a wholly different team, and they also created that capability. The Saudis were a little bit later, but I think now, as you look across the region, all the major players, including Iran, including Syria, have offensive and defensive cyber units that have some relatively good capability.
The UAE is a great case study in what we've been talking about too, because for years they were well known for importing their cyber capability, whether it be from Europe and then later on also from Israel. But as you said, they've spent time building up now a domestic capability. And in a big way, the through line between all of that has been repeated news of abuses, especially domestically. And I think that's a good pivot to talk about what the domestic impact is in terms of the proliferation of cyber capabilities throughout the region. The UAE is not alone in using cyber power for the suppression of dissent, but they've made headlines many times over the last 10 to 15 years for that. And I guess I would just ask at a zoomed out level, what has been that domestic impact in the region's countries as the countries spend money on these capabilities?
Well, I think you have to realize when you hear stories about this or that country, and especially the UAE, using cyber capabilities to suppress dissent, think you have to look at the origin of some of those stories and really just not take them necessarily at face value. These countries live in a rough region. Any country we mention in the Middle East is surrounded by other countries. They're having civil wars or terrorist campaigns or are enemies of each other. It's a very tough region. And slightly different standards sometimes have to be applied in those circumstances. I think the UAE has used cyber capability to thwart terrorist attacks, just as the United States has. We have been able, and they have been able, to penetrate terrorist cells, to learn about plots, to learn about who the people in the cells were. And there haven't been that many terrorist attacks in the UAE, especially when compared to other countries in the region. And one of the reasons for that is the sophistication of their counterintelligence capabilities, including cyber. So I think we have to be careful to not to criticize countries for doing pretty much what we do, which is to use cyber capabilities to penetrate potential terrorist groups. Some people will claim those terrorist groups are not terrorist groups, but I think that decision is probably best made by the people who are the targets of the terrorist groups.
Sounds like there's another hour-long conversation to have there that I would really love to dive into, but I think we might be running up on time, so I won't get too much deeper on that. What I want to do is flip to the other side of that coin. I brought up that question about the domestic impact, and you understandably then connected that to the neighborhood they live in and the international impact. So, in many ways, the headlines, like you said, do come up around the domestic impact, whether that's domestic terrorist attack or suppression of dissent. But can you talk about what this arms race in the Middle East has done to the geopolitical calculus in the region? What's the impact of the fact that they're all developing, investing, and increasing their cyber capabilities?
Well, I think most of them now realize Iran, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, most of the Gulf countries realize that if they were involved in a war, in an overt war, that while missiles would be flying back and forth across the Gulf, there would also be cyber attacks going on. And you can buy anti-missile systems, and the Saudis and the Emiratis have spent a huge amount of money buying advanced anti-missile systems. The Israelis have as well. But can you do that with the cyber attacks? Can you create a cyber shield that will prevent cyber attacks from penetrating and destroying the infrastructure like desalination plants, petrochemical facilities? They're trying to do that. It's less obvious. You don't physically see the equipment, you don't see the money being spent, but I think they're all engaged in an attempt to harden their infrastructure, just as we are here in the United States. But it's more urgent out there. For example, the Iranians have attacked Saudi Arabian facilities and done damage, and could have done a lot more damage if they had gone just one or two steps further. So it's not theoretical out there. The likelihood of war in the region is much higher. The likelihood of major damage to infrastructure through cyber attacks is therefore much higher. This region, and this is the reason for the book, this region is really the first place where we've had this kind of sustained cyber war, low level war, but nonetheless sustained cyber war for the last 10 years or more. The United States has been part of it with our attack on the Iranian nuclear facilities. The Israelis have been part of it, the Iranians, the Emiratis, Saudis. But it's something that goes on every day out there. And sometimes it flares up. Sometimes it's steady state. But all of them are rushing to try to secure their infrastructure and at the same time to penetrate the other guys.
I think that that's a great place to stop with the exclamation point on why this book is timely. And I really did enjoy the book as well as enjoying this conversation, Dick. So thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
For listeners looking for a deep dive into the history and emerging trends in cybersecurity issues in the Middle East, check out MEI's new book, Cyber War and Cyber Peace in the Middle East. Available in print, and for Kindle e-readers, you can find it either on Amazon or on MEI's website at mei.edu/cyber. Thank you to MEI's cyber program for inviting me to host today's conversation, and to MEI's production team for their work on this episode. My name is Patrick Howell O'Neill. Thanks for listening.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.